Following World War I, U.S. foreign policy was one of isolationism. Many Americans were reluctant to get involved in another European conflict. It was not until Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor that there was unified support for America's entry into the Second World War. Even though prior to Pearl Harbor the United States officially declared neutrality in World War II, the nation supported the Allied powers through the transfer of goods. 9 months before Pearl Harbor, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act, which created a pathway for American goods to support the British war effort. Under the provisions of Lend-Lease, the United States could lend military equipment and supplies to any nation the President said was vital to the defense of the United States. Roosevelt approved $1 billion in Lend-Lease aid to Great Britain in October 1941. When the United States entered World War II, $50 billion worth of equipment and supplies had already been sent to Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and China. These nations became allies of the United States after the attack at Pearl Harbor led to the American declaration of war. While the Soviet Union and Great Britain were fighting Germany in Europe, Great Britain also faced Japanese imperial aggression in Asia. Like Great Britain, the United States had economic and territorial interests in the Pacific. The Japanese government began a policy of expansion in the 1890s and targeted the weaker nations of China and Korea, capturing territory from both nations. The United States was angered by Japan's aggression in China. Under U.S. policy, all nations should be able to trade freely in China and respect Chinese territorial integrity. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931 and engaged China in a full-scale war in 1937. China was quickly conquered, except for the southwestern provinces. In September 1940, the Japanese occupied French Indochina, threatening British Malaysia, the Dutch East Indies, and the American Philippines. The United States also repositioned the Pacific Fleet from San Diego to the Hawaiian Islands. In July 1941, the United States placed a total financial and oil embargo on Japan. The Japanese felt they were being directly threatened by the United States and began to plan operations for the takeover of the East Indies, Malay Peninsula, and the Philippines. To prevent any counterattack, the Japanese military felt it was necessary to destroy the American Pacific Fleet. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on the United States Navy base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Over 2,400 Americans were killed, and 1,178 more were wounded. 19 ships were damaged, and over 300 aircraft were destroyed. The Japanese attack brought the United States officially into World War II. On December 8, 1941, the United States declared war on Japan, and on Germany and Italy on December 11th. U.S. troops fought in 2 theaters, in the Pacific and in Europe. Fighting in the Pacific theater presented some strategic difficulties and ultimately resulted to the use of atomic weapons to end the war. The distance across the Pacific was 3 times the distance from New York to Great Britain. It could take up to 5 months for supplies to get from California to Australia. The decision to prioritize the war in Europe routed the best and greatest amount of equipment to Europe. This allocation of resources meant that forces in the Pacific were provided with outdated equipment, and shortages existed until the industrial capacity of the United States could catch up with the demand. Additionally, there was little or no infrastructure to transport and store supplies in the Pacific once they arrived in the theater. Finally, the climate of the Pacific region was difficult to manage and caused food supplies to spoil. These conditions led to the Allied policy of island hopping across islands that served as landing strips. These locations allowed air bombardments of Japanese fortifications. The Pacific Theater presented unique challenges for the United States in delivering food, weapons, and medical supplies to troops in the region during World War II. When the United States fully and officially engaged in World War II, the nation went into a total war effort. to orchestrate the conversion of privately owned manufacturing companies to supply the United States war effort, the Roosevelt administration created the War Production Board. The War Production Board's responsibility was to regulate the production and allocation of materials and fuel. The board stopped the production of non-essential goods, such as automobiles, and imposed a rationing system for gasoline and rubber. Civilian industrial plants soon began producing war goods in great quantities. Plants that had formerly produced silk ribbons instead produced parachutes, and typewriter plants produced machine guns. Ford, General Motors, and other automobile manufacturers produced great numbers of airplanes, tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces. One of the most remarkable feats was the creation of the Liberty ship by Kaiser Aluminum. These ships were created in an assembly line fashion such that eventually a single cargo ship could be produced in just 42 days. Food rationing began in 1942. Items such as sugar, meat, butter, canned vegetables, and fruits all required coupons, also known as rationing stamps. Allotments were based on family size. Many families planted victory gardens to supplement their diets. Consumers knew everyone was in the same position, and the goods they gave up were destined for servicemen and women overseas. At the outbreak of the war, women who already had jobs found that the choices of occupation and the rate of pay suddenly changed for the better. Women served in many different capacities throughout the course of the war. Some women served in the military. There were 216,000 women who volunteered for service in the various branches of the armed services. To meet the demand for labor, the United States government began a campaign to recruit women into the workforce. The government created a fictional ideal woman known as Rosie the Riveter to appeal to women's patriotism. Women worked in many different areas, including munitions, aircraft plants, shipyards, and in more traditional positions as clerks and secretaries. By the war's end, 18 million women had entered the workforce. African American workers, despite receiving training in government-approved programs, were denied access to defense jobs. Many employers refused to hire African American workers. They believed that African Americans could not be trained as mechanics for complex jobs like aircraft construction. A. Philip Randolph, a black labor organizer, had created the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters to fight discrimination in 1925. They presented the president with a memorandum urging his administration to take action to desegregate the armed forces and put an end to discriminatory hiring practices in industries with government contracts. Roosevelt declined the request. President Roosevelt used executive orders during World War II to quickly implement measures that might have stalled in the legislature. Two such areas where he mandated policy outside of the typical legislative process were in integrating the defense industry and the internment of Japanese Americans after the Pearl Harbor attack. A. Philip Randolph began the March on Washington movement in January 1941 as a grassroots movement aimed at forcing the Roosevelt administration to act on discriminatory practices. The media began reporting that 100,000 people were planning to march on Washington in the upcoming July event. Roosevelt feared a race riot might occur in segregated Washington, D.C. if the march took place. Roosevelt also worried that any violence would give a potential propaganda victory to Adolf Hitler. After meeting with Randolph and the head of the NAACP, Roosevelt issued an executive order prohibiting discrimination on government-contracted jobs. While this was a step forward for African Americans, other groups did not fare so well under Roosevelt's executive orders. The United States worried that its large immigrant population of Italians, Germans, and Japanese would pose a security risk in the event of war with the Axis powers. In 1939, at the request of President Roosevelt, the Justice Department developed a list of enemy aliens that included potentially dangerous American citizens and former citizens of Germany, Italy, and Japan who might possibly be spies or saboteurs. These individuals were required to register with the government in 1940. When the war broke out in 1941, suspects on the enemy alien list were arrested. However, very few were held in jail. Most were later released and required to move away from defense facilities and industrial production centers. A second group of suspects included Italian Americans, German Americans, and Japanese Americans. There were simply too many Italian Americans and German Americans to inter. Many Americans believed that the disaster at Pearl Harbor was the result of collusion between Japanese Americans living in California and the Japanese military. Therefore, there was more widespread support for the harsh treatment of these immigrants. The West Coast was designated a security zone, and all potential enemies were to be removed from the region. Eventually, 110,000 Japanese Americans were removed from California, Oregon, and Washington under Executive Order 9066. Whole families were shipped off to the high desert regions of the American West. Many lost their homes, businesses, and farms. While these conflicts played out on the home front, military action continued in the Pacific. The United States won a sea battle against the Japanese Navy that was a turning point in World War II. The Japanese tried to trap and sink America's aircraft carriers near Midway Island, which was an American refueling station for ships and airplanes. In the battle at Midway, the United States destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers while losing only 1 American carrier. The American victory at Midway is regarded as the most important naval engagement of the Pacific Campaign. The success was also a huge morale boost for the United States. The Japanese never recovered from this defeat, which enabled the United States to gain control of other strategic Pacific islands. In addition to fighting in the Pacific theater, the United States was also engaged in the European theater of World War II. The United States was the prime supplier of war material to the Allies. This made it necessary to cross the Atlantic Ocean, which took between 10 and 15 days, and was marked by threats from German submarines and aircraft. The American ships and their cargo were needed to feed and supply the Allied soldiers and the British civilian population. After landing troops on the coast of France and Italy, supplies followed the forces inland using the existing road networks. However, the farther the Allied forces moved from the coast, the longer it took to get supplies to the front lines. Gasoline was a particular problem for Allied forces that relied heavily on mobile warfare. In fact, the Allied advance stalled in November 1944 because the armored units ran short of fuel. One of the most significant events in the European theater of World War II was the Allied invasion of Normandy, France, which is often referred to as D-Day. This victory began the Allied advance to reclaim Europe. D-Day was the code name for the first day of Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied France. It remains the largest seaborne invasion in history, with over 156,000 men crossing the English Channel in 6,939 vessels. When the Allies landed at Normandy, the German troops occupying the heavily fortified French coast were unprepared. The Germans had been tricked by the Allies into thinking that the Allied troops would land in a different location. Although the Allies met heavy resistance, the invasion went largely according to plan. As a result of the operation's success, American and British forces were able to maintain a permanent beachhead in mainland Europe to resupply their forces and push east to Germany. The geographic advantage gained by the invasion marked the beginning of victory for the Allies in Europe. The Battle of Berlin was one of the final battles of the European theater during World War II. 2 Soviet army groups attacked Berlin from the east and south, while a third attacked German forces north of Berlin. The Soviets lost 81,116 men taking the city, while the Germans lost 458,080 trying to defend it. The battle was one of the bloodiest in history. Adolf Hitler was in Berlin during the battle, and before it ended with Soviet occupation, he and many of his followers committed suicide. The city's defenders surrendered on May 2, 1945, but fighting continued outside the city until the formal German surrender known as VE Day ended the war in Europe on May 8, 1945. With victory in Europe secured, Allied forces shifted resources to the Pacific. Eventually, the island-hopping campaign in the Pacific led President Truman to a critical juncture. President Roosevelt had died in early 1945, and Harry Truman was the new president responsible for making decisions regarding the conduct of the war. Should the United States use a new atomic weapon, or would a military invasion of Japan's mainland be necessary to achieve victory in the Pacific? The development of the atomic weapon had been a tightly held secret and would certainly cause significant damage if used in battle. The Manhattan Project was the code name for a secret research and development program whose goal was to build an atomic weapon during World War II. Scientists, including some who fled Europe in the early 1930s, among them Albert Einstein, feared that German physicists were developing an atomic weapon for Hitler. The scientists urged Roosevelt and Churchill to create a similar program. United States General Leslie Groves led the development of numerous research labs, where 3 atomic weapons were ultimately created. One of the research labs was the Los Alamos facility in New Mexico. The Los Alamos facility was the location of the first atomic weapon test. Plans for an Allied invasion of Japan were underway, and estimates suggested there could be as many as 1 million Allied casualties. The successful atomic weapon test led to the creation of 2 working bombs that were subsequently used against the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in a successful bid to convince the Japanese to surrender. The use of the bombs eliminated the need for an invasion of the Japanese mainland, thus saving countless American lives. The military's use of these atomic bombs led to 2 important developments. First, the surrender of the Japanese government was secured, which ended World War II. Second, the development of the atomic bomb spurred a new, more dangerous arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States. The creation of government-sponsored and financed research and development labs became a model for future weapons development programs. These programs were led by military officers and used research scientists to produce the technology necessary for national defense. Similar research and development models were used by civilian corporations to create goods that could be used by both the government and civilians. The mass production of isotopes led to the development of nuclear medicine and the use of atomic energy for electrical power.